Video, we're going to tell you guys how to pressure test your cooling system and also why you would want to and what you should do about it. So, as always, you have questions, drop them in the comments. If you like these kinds of videos, please like, comment, subscribe. Super helpful for us. And if we don't get to the questions live, we'll get to them after the fact and answer them in the comments themselves. So, what is a cooling system pressure test? So first thing, let's do a really brief overview on how a cooling system operates. The really short version is, for the purposes of this video, is that it's a water-cooled engine, and all of this is going to apply to any engine that's water-cooled, by the way. So your really old VW Beetle, sorry, you don't need to watch this video. Everything else that is water-cooled, this is all applicable. So you have your cooling system. It has coolant in it. It's in the engine, it's in the radiator, and it's in the parts in between. When the engine gets hot, it transfers the heat to the coolant. That transfers the heat to the radiator sheds it to the environment. Part of what happens in there is that your system, because of the heat, increases in pressure. So because of that increase in pressure, you are more likely to have a leak under the actual operation of the car than you are with it just sitting there, or even with it running, but when it's completely cold. So your radiator cap is basically an overflow. It's a pop-off valve. So your radiator cap has a spring in there, and that spring dictates the pressure of the cooling system. That's why your radiator cap is going to have a number on it for what the pressure is. We typically like 16 psi for a fairly normal setup. For more race, less coolant, all that kind of stuff, you want a higher pressure cap, which we do offer. And we have our shiny caps with silicone seals and all that fun stuff as well. So what happens is that when your system gets over pressure, this little seat comes off and coolant flows out into your hose, into the overflow tank. Different systems are slightly different. Sometimes your overflow tank is actually pressurized, meaning it's actually an expansion tank, and there's just a hose that dumps onto the ground. That's how the NCs are. But generally speaking, all water-cooled stuff is going to be the same way. So why would you want to do a cooling system pressure test? Because you have a problem, or because you think you have a problem, or because you have a brand new install of a thing and you want to make sure that you haven't caused a new problem. So if you're losing coolant, if you're smelling coolant, if you see a puddle on the floor, or even if you smell coolant but don't have a puddle anywhere, because sometimes it burns off before it actually puddles up anywhere. Also, if it's a new install, particularly the more comprehensive, the more important it is to do a pressure test. You know, if you're just replacing the upper radiator hose, you know, the conservative choice is to do a pressure test. Really, if that's the only thing you did, you can probably get away without it. If you've put one of our kits on there and you've done a whole lot, you know, you did a new radiator as part of that, new hoses and all this kind of stuff, really good idea to pressure test the system to make sure that you don't have leaks. Because leaks might be annoying in the garage, but they are way worse when you're out there on the road without tools, without extra coolant, all that fun stuff. So, how do you do a cooling system pressure test? Number one, do not do it on a hot car. I will roll back to the beginning of this video. This system, when hot, is pressurized. If you take this cap off, when it is hot, it will blow up in your face and scald you, and you will be having a very unpleasant trip to the emergency room. So think about it. If it's kind of warm-ish, keep pressure down on there, gently turn it, gently release it, and make sure that it doesn't have any, or at least has very little pressure in it. A rag can also be helpful to kind of protect yourself and not eliminate the mess, but bring it down a notch at least. So that is job number one. That obviously applies all the time, very important. So, excuse me. With that in mind, you want to make sure that your system is full of water. So it can't have air in it. And that doesn't mean you need to be really crazy about it being perfectly bled, but air is compressible. So you're going to be working on your pressure tester pump for a long time if you have air in there, or a significant volume of air. Air is going to make it harder to find the leak because nothing is coming out. air could potentially also cause a false positive. I've had that happen before and ripped my hair out for a while until I filled it up with coolant, and then, hey, the leak was gone. So those are good things to bear in mind. Now, you need a cooling system pressure tester. This is a nice one from Snap-on. You can see you've got a few different caps here. The Miata uses a mini Type A radiator cap. It kind of looks like this. You can see the different shapes. These are both minis. This one is a Type A, this one is a Type B. So you've got your adapter that's going to go between whatever your specific cap design is and the tester itself. And I'm not going to do the full test. There's going to be some assumptions in here. This is totally cold, so I don't need to be careful about taking it off. Okay, we take the cap off, set it aside. We're going to put our tester on, or our adapter rather. Adapter goes on there. Our tester goes on here, and there are tangs that you've got to line up, but you know, different testers may be a little different. I'm not going to get real deep into the details of this specific one. And then you just pressurize it. So what do you pressurize it to? Good question. You want to aim, what I like to do is aim for the cap, for the pressure on your cap plus a couple of PSI. I like to put a little bit of, let's call it safety factor in there. Because again, if something's going to fail, I want it to fail here, not out there. Maybe there's a little bit of noise. Maybe my cap is just a tick tighter than what it says it is, something like that. So I would go a little over, but don't go a lot over. You don't want to cause a problem that didn't exist. But you do want to go all the way up to your cap pressure, because if you test a 10 PSI and you have a 20 PSI cap on it, you might not have a leak at 10 PSI, but you might have a leak at 20 PSI. So you want to go all the way up to that pressure. From there, basically just look and listen. You want to, sometimes the hoses can be a little bit hard to put eyeballs on. Use a flashlight, use a mirror. Maybe you need to get the car up in the air. Maybe you have an idea of where it's leaking and you know exactly where to look. Maybe it's leaking at your water pump gasket, so it's back behind here, so you're not really going to be able to see it, but you should be able to hear it, and you might eventually see a dribble down at the front bottom of the engine. So you're going to need to kind of do a little bit of investigation. Sometimes they're super obvious and you won't be able to put any pressure in the system. Sometimes they're pretty tough to find. Excuse me. You also, lost my train of thought for a sec there. Sometimes the leaks will only happen when the car is hot. Those are a pain. So those can be much more difficult to find. It's not very common, but it is a possibility, so you may have to kind of get creative. Maybe you go out, take the car for a drive, don't let it cool down at all, put it right back in the garage, on ramps, whatever, and then you start poking around with it. Because if it's fully warm and up to temperature, then it should be reasonably up in pressure. It's not going to be all the way up to your cap unless you're nearly overheating, but that could be a way if it only appears when it's hot. So do all that. If you don't find any leaks there, sweet, good, you're not done. Let it sit for at least 10 minutes. Kind of the longer the better, but you want to let it sit for a long time. Make note, use a dry erase marker or take a picture or whatever, but make note of the exact pressure that you've got in here. Leave it there. Come back after it's been sitting again for at least 10 minutes. If we got particularly problematic cars, sometimes we'll let it sit for an hour. And see if you've lost any pressure. If you have lost pressure, make sure it's not your tester and it's a false positive because your tools aren't good. But otherwise, you've got a leak somewhere in there you've got to figure out. So investigate, look, flashlights, mirrors, all that fun stuff. Once you are done, you're going to release the pressure. Heads up, you're probably going to make a mess. Definitely lots of rags and paper towels. Regardless of how gently I try to release the pressure, it always bubbles up, at least with the testers that I've used. So really that is the coolant experience. Because as Keith likes to say, his experience is that coolant is allergic to people, and if it gets anywhere near a person, it has to run away and make a mess everywhere. And that has absolutely been my experience as well. Impossible to do anything coolant-wise without making a mess. Kind of annoying. Okay, so if you find something, fix it. Seems pretty straightforward. Whatever it is, then test it again. You know, it depends on your confidence level and your available time and all that business, but the conservative choice is certainly to test it again, make sure that you did actually fix it, make sure that, you know, this one failed at 6 PSI, but then when you fixed it, this other one failed at 10 PSI, something like that. So again, you want to make sure that it holds full operating pressure for at least 10 minutes before you can call the system leak-free and good. Okay, so what if you don't find anything but you're losing coolant? So it could be the pressure, it could be the radiator cap. Again, if this pressure is too low, then it's going to pee into the overflow tank, and then overflow tanks always have a vent, so it could pee onto the ground at that point. You can get testers that allow you to hook up your cooling system pressure tester to your cap, and you can test it that way to see at what pressure the cap pops off. Caps tend to last a while, but not necessarily forever. If you're having overheating issues and you're not really sure, or you just want to kind of give it a shot and the caps aren't that expensive, throw a new cap on it, see what happens. So it's a really cheap and easy kind of thing to do. So kind of general cooling system maintenance, as well as some hints. The first hint is don't use worm gear clamps. Worm gear clamps that are on a million different cars on the cooling systems. I feel like we've all done it. They're easily available at any local auto parts store. Are maybe not awesome. Typically, you get them snug, everything's great, you pressure test it, no leaks, no problem. You drive it for a little bit, you get a few heat cycles on it, now all of a sudden it's leaking everywhere. Well, I tested it, everything was fine, what's going on? Probably your worm gear clamps, because they have a tendency to loosen up and you need to tighten them a couple times. This is why the OEs use spring clamps. They might be ugly, they might be a little bitey sometimes and snapping at your fingers, but they work very, very well, and they have a little bit of give in them so that they can expand and contract with pressure, or excuse me, with temperature. Same deal with the constant torque or constant tension clamps. When you have these washers stacked up here, those will do that same thing, as long as the clamps are used properly, which really just means don't over tighten them. But those work very well. Generic worm gear clamps, that could be a problem. Whenever you're in there, always check your hoses. Give them a squeeze. Are they soft and pliable? Sweet. Are they spongy? That's not the same as soft, and that's bad. Are they really hard and brittle? Better address that problem before it causes a big issue. And then the thermostat. Thermostat is a little more difficult to test. If you want to test it, take it out. The internet will tell you how to do that, is a short version. But if your car is running a little hot and there's no explanation for it, maybe your thermostat is getting stuck closed. Maybe just replace that. They're cheap. They are a little bit of a headache and very messy to change, but otherwise not a big deal. Okay, I think I covered everything on my list. Let's see. Yeah, I think, okay, I am satisfied. Okay, so we got a few questions. I'll go through the ones ahead of time, and then we'll go through live questions. I see Mike flailing around in the background, so whoever that is, we got you. We'll get to you. Okay, when and why would I ever need to do this? Because you have a problem with your cooling system, or because you have just made a big change to your cooling system, and that's not necessarily an upgrade. That could just be replacing parts, and you want to make sure that there are no leaks. It's a good thing to do to make sure that you don't have to put the car back in the garage. Can you recommend a pressure tester that works with your crossflow? Testers I've found at parts stores leak from the mouth on your crossflow radiator. That is a new one. So this is a snap-on tester, works great. Sometimes see, it's going to make a mess anyway. I haven't actually pressurized it at all. All right, we're gonna worry about that later. Sometimes this guy can stick out a little too far. We actually modify our coolant funnel kits for that reason. So I just bought, personally, I got a generic one off of Amazon. Works great, never had any problems with it. So there are plenty out there that work. Maybe make sure that this depth is no deeper, or it's rubber and it's supposed to seal, so not dramatically deeper than the depth of that piece in the cap, or in the piece on the radiator that the cap spins onto. Okay, can this be done on all Miatas or just NA and B? Again, this is for all Miatas, including anything else that is water cooled. So maybe not literally, but really close. So any kind of water cooled automotive application, it's going to be the same process, with the exception of the specific type of cap you use, but it's kind of a given. Would pressure testing the system cause a new leak? Maybe. If it does, be thankful, because that's a leak that happened in the garage and not out on the road. I would not skip doing a pressure test because you're afraid it might cause a leak, because if it, again, that leak would happen eventually on the road and it would be a big headache. So the short answer to your question is no, or you want it to do that anyway. How much pressure is too much pressure? Again, aim for the cap pressure plus a couple PSI, just to, again, you want it to fail in the garage, not on the road. But don't aim for 30, 40, 50 PSI. Then you're going to start breaking stuff that never would have broken in the first place. Okay, and those are all the questions we had ahead of time. Mike?
So, as far as cooling systems, because we have NAs, NBs, and there's NC, NDs, where overflow tanks are pressurized and whatnot in some applications, is it better to have a plastic or aluminum or metal tank, and does it make any difference how you test it?
Okay, so is it better to have a plastic or metal overflow / expansion tank? Metal is going to be more durable. It's going to be prettier. They are typically, I believe, more expensive than a plastic one, and a plastic one makes it a little bit easier to check the level, which is why we insist on sight tubes as opposed to sight glasses on all of our metal tanks. So this, yeah, it's not as good as a stock tank, but it tells you what the level is, as opposed to the coolant is up to here, or the coolant is somewhere between this level and totally dry. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the sight glass. I prefer the sight tube. So plastic tanks can fail long term. If it's an overflow tank, so again, overflow is like this. It's not pressurized. Your cap is on the radiator, and this is just a place to hold excess coolant. With an expansion tank, like on the NC, and only the NC as far as Miatas are concerned, that is pressurized, so it's kind of a pressurized overflow tank is a really simple way of looking at it. It is more of a potential problem with a pressurized expansion tank, because a crack is, it's designed a lot stronger in the first place because that's the application, but a crack is probably more likely to happen because it's constantly under pressure. And if a crack happens, it's going to cause a big problem. If a crack happens here in your overflow tank and your cooling system is working totally fine, otherwise you're not overheating, anything like that, doesn't make any difference, because this is just an overflow. This is just for excess coolant to go in and out of the radiator as it needs to. With an expansion tank, that is an integral part of your cooling system that is constantly being used. So if you have a crack in your expansion tank, it's going to be peeing coolant out all the time because coolant is constantly being dumped into that. So I might have been a little wordy, but hopefully that answers the question. More questions?
Say you're chasing a leak and you can't figure it out, can't find it, and then the question is brought up, what about silicone versus rubber hoses? Is there any issue with permeation that one or the other would lose pressure that you wouldn't be able to track down?
So basically the question is, between rubber and silicone hoses, are you more likely to lose pressure in one than the other? No. So the silicone is slightly more permeable than rubber, so that could be a kind of a big picture thing. In terms of a cooling system pressure test, it's not something that I would expect to see in a test. I mean, case in point, most of our cars have at least a couple of silicone hoses on them, cooling system-wise, and we don't have to worry about the level dropping or keeping it constantly topped off because it's permeating through the silicone, that kind of thing. That's not something you need to worry about. That said, in a laboratory situation, yes, silicone is more permeable than rubber.
Would you mind talking about radiator cap pressures a little bit?
Sure. So I'm supposed to talk about radiator cap pressures. So radiator cap pressure. You need to have a functional radiator cap in your system to allow the pressure to come up, but also not allow it to go too high. Why do you want the pressure to come up? Because higher pressure means lower boiling point, and you do not want your coolant to boil within the cooling system. So that is why, now the flip side or related argument to that is the higher the pressure, the more likely it is that you have a leak. You know, something that was fine at 16 PSI, but is not fine at 20 PSI, if you don't need a 20 PSI cap, but you put one on, now you've caused a problem that didn't exist in the first place. That said, if you are running a like a water and water wetter mix, because water does transfer heat better than coolant does. So, and which, sidebar, is why we recommend 70% distilled water and 30% antifreeze typically. Make sure it's safe for your winter conditions, but it is safe for most. But when you're using that 100% water, your boiling point is lower, which means that you need to have a higher pressure cap in order to keep the coolant mix, your water, from boiling in the engine. Coolant boils at a higher temperature than water, so therefore we can get away with a lower pressure in the cooling system and not have boiling, or have a boiling that will happen at a high temperature. Hopefully that all makes sense. The super duper short version is use a 16 PSI cap unless you have a specific reason to use a higher pressure cap. If you do have a specific reason, sweet, no worries. A little higher risk, you'll probably still be fine. I'm not that concerned about it, but why open up the potential if there's no need for it? Good? No more questions? All right. Okay, well, thank you again, as always. And also, as always, if you have more questions you come up with after the fact, whatever, drop them in the comments, reach out to our awesome CSRs. If you like this, again, like, comment, subscribe, all really good stuff for us, helps us keep putting these videos out. And speaking of, we'll be back, as always, next Thursday with another FM Live. So be sure to check in for that. All right, thanks everybody.